After a crazy season of some of the best isekai and fantasy currently out there, now things have slowed down with not much of anything. For the first time in a while, we only have one new isekai, so I'm kind of at a loss for what I'm gonna cover this season. Luckily, the Overlord movie did just recently come out on Blu-ray, so expect videos for that along with some catch-up on ReZero and Danmachi. Now, to start with the sequels of spring 2025, first we have Fire Force Season 3, a two-part continuation to the series, with the first starting now, then the second coming later in January of next year. Supposedly, this will be the lead up to the conclusion of Fire Force as a whole, so if you're a fan of the series, expect things to start wrapping up. That said, there are still about 130 chapters of the manga left to cover, so while that may sound like a lot compared to the 175 they covered in the first 50 episodes, it is possible they fit these 130 into just 24. This is, after all, the most climactic part of the series, and a lot of the content will be fights and action which go by a whole lot faster than world building and dialogue. Either way, it should be a good finale to the series, what with David Production remaining as the studio responsible. Slime 300 returns with Season 2, 4 years after the original, which for some reason just doesn't feel right. To me, this was a series that feels like came out max 2 years ago. I guess it just fell into a weird place back during the crazy COVID days. In any case, this lighthearted fantasy and the witch starring as our protagonist will be back with much of the same shenanigans as the first season. We got an ever-expanding cast and the comfy family dynamic, all within the standard fantasy isekai setting we know and love. Loser Ranger brings us its second core disguised as a second season, since the original series was always planned to have 2 cores. I myself didn't get a chance to watch it due to it being in Disney jail, but I have heard good things about this subverted depiction of the Power Ranger formula. Like, the Power Rangers are actually the bad guys, and it's the powerless dusters beneath them who need to expose the farce they've manufactured around them. It's an overarching plot that I've actually seen a lot of people compare to The Boys. So, if you haven't had the chance to watch this underdog show yourself, then perhaps this might be the season to check it out. Finally, we have Season 2 for Bye Bye Earth, which, though not as popular as any of the previous entries, does present a more complex and compelling story. This isn't one of those series that explains things right from the get-go, so a second season like this will definitely be good to answer a lot of the questions I'm sure you had if you watched Season 1. Whether that makes it entertaining is up for you to decide, but if you're looking for something to get you thinking, then this might be worth watching for you. Now, let's move on to the new anime, starting with a series that's both highly anticipated and expected to be disappointing. This is The Beginning After the End, and though very possibly one of the big 3 for online webcomics, I refuse to get my hopes up since the trailers honestly haven't shown me anything worth getting hyped over. As much as I want to treat this like the next Solo Leveling, we just can't, since that would be disrespectful to Solo Leveling, especially with the crazy adaptation we just got for it. Still, the story itself might be adapted well, so if we set aside the generic look it unfortunately has, there is a chance that the plot can carry it. That's a topic I plan to cover in a separate video, but if you want an abridged version, it's essentially this. The strongest king in history, whose life was rather empty, reincarnates as a powerless boy seeking to live this new life more fully. That may sound a bit familiar to Mushoku Tensei, and while it certainly is in the early stages of our protagonist's reincarnation, he differs later on with both the way he fights and the reason he's fighting for. So, where Mushoku Tensei is more of this slow burn with its plot and character progression, The Beginning After the End is more of a classic power fantasy, albeit a well-written one. So, take with that what you will, and at the very least I'd suggest giving it a shot. There's a reason why it's as popular as it is online, so we can only hope the anime does its best to portray that. Now, the one new isekai we'll be getting this season is surprisingly unique in the form of I'm the evil lord of an intergalactic empire. If I had to sum it up in one sentence only, imagine your standard isekai protagonist reincarnated as the leader of one of the evil factions in Gundam. Or better yet, imagine them reincarnated as the replacement for Palpatine in Star Wars. Mix in an army of mechs and a goal to take over an interstellar empire, and that's pretty much what you have here. It's an interesting take on isekai that finally brings us to the future for once. Sure, it does seem to keep a lot of the standard fantasy tropes, but I like the heavy sci-fi theme as well. Plus, it's giving off a more chill Overlord vibe. This is the series I'm personally looking forward to the most, since aside from looking like the life story of Paul Greyrat, from old country bumpkin to master swordsman actually looks polished. A retired teacher of the sword suddenly gets appointed as a special instructor for the kingdom's knights, leading him to once again become a teacher to a lot of his former students. The thing is, with them now extremely successful with titles like Elite Knight and Ace Adventurer, he doesn't see why they really need him anymore. So, that's the setting where this power fantasy takes place, and while certainly not anything entirely different, it does have lots of action and is praised for its fights. I imagine it'll be an entertaining watch so long as the fights are portrayed properly. Sword of the Demon Hunter slows things down with an Eastern-type fantasy, focusing on a time-traveling demon hunter struggling to find his purpose in life. It's a series deeply rooted in its characters and their motivations, so while at first glance this may seem like something akin to Demon Slayer, it definitely has its own two legs to stand on. So, if you're a fan of the various eras of Japan and the people within them, then I think this might be worth the watch for you. This is the brilliant healer's new life in the shadows, and just as the title states, gives us a healer who runs an underground healing clinic. It's kinda like if Eminence in Shadows centered around a healer instead of the god of edginess. Our protagonist is a guy whose life has never been filled with opportunities, so when he finally takes things into his own hands, his self-taught healing magic becomes the means to build his life anew. It just so happens to be as a so-called shadow healer. The unaware Atelier master brings us Discount Bell from Danmachi, all the way down to his hairstyle and armor. Even his personality is somewhat similar too, since Kurt's the type of protagonist who's both kind-hearted and naive. He's just not skilled when it comes to combat, but with regards to everything else, he's apparently the best. It's a trait Kurt himself doesn't seem to be aware of. So, I don't know if that makes this an inverse power fantasy, but with Kurt being overpowered in pretty much everything that's not fighting, I imagine a premise like this should make for some interesting encounters. We just have to wait and see if it turns out that way. Next, we have Once Upon a Witch's Death, which is a more modern fantasy centering around a girl cursed with only 1 year to live. This girl is also the apprentice of one of the 7 sages, who informs her the only way to break the curse is to become immortal. How does she become immortal? Well, she first needs to collect tears of joy from 1,000 different people. Only then can she make the Seed of Life and do so. So, in a similar vein to Violet Evergarden or The Wandering Witch Elaine, this is a show that takes you on an emotional journey where each encounter is different. It's, at its core, a drama revolving around the interactions with her. This is the romance fantasy The Two Perfect Saint, and while dealing with a protagonist that's overpowered, her exceptional abilities is actually what makes her the problem. She's deemed as insufferable by those around her, and as a result is sold off to the neighboring country. This is because saints are an existence every country desires, so despite her being apparently miserable, she's still a powerful presence worth having. It's then the story becomes focused on this saint and her new life in a brand new country. The Gorilla God's Go-To Girl follows a rather similar path, since it too also deals with a gifted protagonist and quite a bit of romance. You see, this is a world where people are blessed by gods represented by various animals, so when the main character is blessed by the Gorilla God, she's given incredible power that attracts the attention of the royal knights. This is where the reverse harem comes into play, and it's essentially her trying not to stand out amongst them. Now, Teogonia does hint at being an isekai, but the extent to which it is seems to just be cloudy memories from a past life. The real essence of the story comes in the form of a classic underdog tale, centering around a protagonist struggling to survive in what's called the Borderland. It's a grim setting where him and his village are constantly at risk from the relentless invasion of demi-beasts trying to take their territory. He's by no means very powerful, so we're shown his fight to survive along with the gradual understanding of a past life that's extremely vague to him. It's one of those series that not many people knew about before, so I'm curious to see if it can garner some traction. Another anime I'm fairly intrigued by is Compass 2.0 with its seemingly intricate game world. I still don't fully understand what it's about, but it almost seems Fate-like with the way heroes from a different world partner together with humans to fight against each other. Now, there's no source material other than the mobile game from 2016, so I imagine if it's getting an anime, it was pretty successful. Either way, I'm always a sucker for strategy-focused game anime like this one. We just gotta hope it has some depth to it. Finally, we have our seasonal idol fantasy, bringing us a magical girl hybrid in the form of Princession Orchestra. It's an original series from Studio Silverlink, so aside from the existential monster threat and the princesses that fight against it, there's really not much else to say about it. So, If you're looking for what the synopsis describes as a pop song fantasia filled with energy and bravery, then by all means knock yourself out with this one. Now, there is one last anime I do want to recommend, and though it's not an isekai or a fantasy, it is a cool looking sci-fi original coming from Wit Studio on Netflix. You can always expect Wit to give us some of the best animation, and with this looking to be an action-packed sci-fi epic, I think we might be in for a treat with this one. It seems like a Gundam-type story without the mechs, one focused on revenge, politics, and war. But yeah, that's pretty much it for spring 2025. Let me know which of these you plan on watching, and if there's a certain show you think would do well for me to talk about, let me know down in the comments too. I will for the most part just be doing catch-up, so expect videos for Danmachi, Overlord, and ReZero. So, until then, ciao!